Beautiful. So before we get into the Chazara, the review of our last meeting together, let's bless. I hope you'll join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam.
Oh, that was my fault. Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot divrei Torah.
Amen ve'amen. So last week we continued our discussion of Olam Haba. We noted that Olam Haba and other understandings of life after death, both in our tradition of Judaism and other monotheistic faiths, are not simply a prediction of the future, but these understandings arose from the yearning of those who suffer in this life, and all of us have a moment of suffering or two at the very least. All of those who suffer in this life to know that they do so, for some greater purpose, or at least they will have less pain in the future. Additionally, we spoke about the use of Olam Haba as a literary device to explore the meaning of this life, Olam Hazeh, rather than life after death. We saw this especially in Brachot 17a, in which one of our sages proclaimed that if you teach Torah in this world, so too in the world to come, you will be teaching Torah. In other words, and in many ways, seemingly our occupations, at least, are pretty similar between this life and the life after death.
At least if you're a rabbi.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, it doesn't say anything for the other occupations,
True.
so perhaps we can assume or infer one or the other. So we also learned the story of Naval, Abigail, and King David. In this story, we found our focal point for the second half of our class, as King David's troops were about to battle Naval's men head on. Abigail, his wife, rides out to meet him, and you can almost see it in your mind, this extremely dramatic moment in which this entire army of the king is coming this way with King David up front, and then Naval's men are kind of coming this way behind Abigail, who's riding all the way up, very forceful as a woman in this time, especially. She dismounts from her horse immediately, blessing King David. And here we have the only usage of the phrase "Srura bitzror hachayim," which in the entire Tanakh. So she says, and I'll just quote the entire verse, "And if anyone sets out to pursue you, King David, and seek your life, the life of my Lord," here's our Hebrew, "will be bound up in the bundle of life, in the care of God, who will fling away the lives of your enemies as from the hollow," or the literal word is the palm of the sling. So it's a reference, of course, to King David, who killed Goliath, a mere child up against a giant, with just a few rocks and a slingshot. This phrase, tsrura, or bitzror achayim at least, is used in our morning prayer, El Male Rachamim, as the place where souls go when their bodies perish. They are bound up in the bonds of life. Oh, beautiful. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. I put this image on the screen just to amplify your point, Rabbi. Many people ask me, what are those 5 Hebrew letters at the bottom of many traditional Jewish gravestones? Mr. Horowitz of blessed memory, whose image of headstone just happens to be available if you Google search, is one such example. You can see at the foot of the headstone these 5 Hebrew letters: Tav, Nun, Tzadi, Bet, with a little apostrophe, which in Hebrew is called a chupchik, which means a doodad, Hey, which indicates that this is how Hebrew abbreviations or acronyms are formulated. Tehi Nishmato Tsarur bitzrur hachayim. May, tihi, may, nishmato, his soul, his neshama. Tsarur means be bound up. Bitzrur, in the bonds. Hachayim, of life, or of life eternal. So very traditional phrase from the El Male prayer that is often inscribed in stone as the final epigram or epitaph on a loved one's gravestone.
Beautiful, beautiful. So this is something that is really laden heavily in our tradition, not just something that we say or that is a part of our literature, our liturgy, but it's a part of physical monuments to those who we've walked this earth before. Okay, so we're going to move into Shabbat 152, the very end of A and then into B. So this tractate, Tractate Shabbat, does not only deal with the concept we're exploring right now, Torah Chaim, but it is this section is actually within a huge section discussing death and mourning, which you might not think would be in Tractate Shabbat. So instead of skipping exactly to that one piece that talks about Torah Chaim, I want to get a little bit into it. So you'll see that we are going to dive into the very, very last piece on page 152A, and then we'll go into 152B, the other side of the daf, the other side of the page. So we have Amar Rav Yehuda. So Rav Yehuda says, Meit she'ein lo menachamin. So a deceased person that does not have anyone who is comforting them. Holchin asara b'nei adam v'yoshvin bimkomo. Okay, so you should get together, or 10 people should come to this person and sit in his place, sit with him. Hahu dishchev b'shivavute. So we can see that there's a little bit of Aramaic here. De Rav Yehuda, lo hayu lo menachamin, and it goes right into the next piece. So we'll translate, but it's really just continuing the sentence into the next page. So one time there was a person who died, and he was in Rav Yehuda's neighborhood, and you can see in this word, even though it's the Aramaic, you can see kind of the similar word as moshav, which is a dwelling area. And if you've been to Israel, you've gone to a moshav or two. Moshavim, in fact, is the plural, and it's just a word for neighborhood or a dwelling place. Okay, so this person died in Rabbi Yehuda's neighborhood, Rabbi Yehuda's moshav, and they didn't have anyone to come comfort them. And we'll notice also menachamin, we have that word nach, that's comfort. We'll also see a different usage of that word in just a second. So kol yoma hava davar Rav Yehuda be Asra. So Rav Yehuda, every single day, kol yoma, same thing as kol yom, every day, Rav Yehuda would take 10 vayatvi beduchte, and would go and sit in that person's place. Okay, so then la'achar Shiv'a yamim itchazi le bechelme de Rav Yehuda va'amar le tanuach, right? We have that nach again. Tanuach datcha shehinachta et dati. Okay, so we have this beautiful moment. So after 7 days, right, the time of Shiva traditionally, after 7 days, the person who had passed, appears to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream, right? So this is really a ethereal moment. And he says to, and Rabbi Yehuda in his dream, and he says to him, put your mind at rest, for you have put my mind at rest. So, and we see that rest word, it's not just comforted, it's not just rest, that nach, but it's that same similar root as we had before, the comforting. So this is really an incredible moment of a person's memory coming to a living person and said, you did the mitzvah. You've done this mitzvah, and as a result, I am spiritually sound. I'm comforted, I'm at rest, I'm at peace. Though we also know that we can't, though there are moments in which we do have rest after a loved one dies, we don't ever forget their memory and who they were. And so too, the sages' minds, you would think that they would move on to a completely different topic now, but the sages' minds are also not quite at rest. And you can see this in the way that our Talmud is literally set up, right? You would think that now we would go to a completely different topic. Instead, we stay on this topic of death and dying. We don't get to go back to the conversation of Shabbat. We continue understanding the life after and how people and how different people's memories or the idea of who a person was is able to understand what we want and need. Okay. So we continue, and now we're in a slightly new situation. Amar Rabbi Avahu, and we didn't do this with Rabbi Yehuda because we were just moving right through it, but we have our handy dandy resources tab over here that tells us that Rabbi Abahu was an Amora of the third generation, and Rabbi Abahu was born and lived in the Roman provincial capital of Caesarea. He studied under Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, but eventually set up his own academy in his hometown. Good for him. Wealthy and well-liked by the Romans, he frequently interceded with them for his fellow Jews. He was also known for his humility and piety. We'll see if that comes through here. So we have Rabbi Abahu saying, Kol she'omrim bifnei hamet. So everything that a person says to the face of a mate, the face of a deceased person, and mate here is not just a term for a dead body, but it's really a term of reverence for this vessel of what was at one point. Yodea, everything that a person says to a deceased person, they know, they hear. Ad sheyisatem hagolel, until the top stone of the tombstone is pushed over the top of the aron, and we see this word golel. And if you've ever had the honor of doing a galila at a service, you know that that's not only dressing the Torah, but golel is a rolling understanding. So right when you're taking the top of the Torah and you're rolling the scroll back together, that's where this word comes from. Okay. So here's our motion, as we would say in a formal debate. Pligi ba. So this word pligi, and we'll just even highlight it. We'll use the Jastro here. It literally means to divide, but we see right now is a differing in opinion. This is a particular word that is used in halachic debates, specifically in the Talmud. And it says, and it's supposed to make a light bulb go off in your brain or make an alert go off in your brain and say, ding, 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 we're going to see a debate happen. We're going to see a differing of opinion. So, pligi ba, Rabbi Hiyya. So we have Rabbi Hiyya. He is an Amora, and he is, I think, it says Tana slash Amora in the transition era between 200 and 220 CE. This is really most of the traditional sources say Rabbi Hiyya is an Amora mamash, so not so much of a Tana anymore, but an Amora. And he is arguing with, who is the opponent? Rabbi Shimon be Rabbi. So this is a pretty intense debate. We have Rabbi Hiyya, who is a super scholar, and Rabbi Shimon be Rabbi, this B here in the B Rabbi stands for son of, Ben Rabbi. So we've talked a lot about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. This is a person with some legacy status right here. Okay, so we have our pligi, our disagreement between these two Amoraim during this transition time. These were some chavruta. Now we have our arguments, and you're going to notice that our Talmud, and maybe you have some ideas as to why, but our Talmud loves to do this thing where it says, there is this argument between these two different parties, and one party thought this, another party thought this, and we're not going to tell you which one thought what. You might find it in some of the gloss, and if you read the Steinsaltz in the original language, in the Hebrew, in the kind of Hebrew translation of Aramaic, you'll see that he kind of posits a guess as to who thought what, who held which argument, but that's not actually in the official text of the Talmud. Okay, so Chad Amar, one of them, right, Echad, Chad, one of them said, Ad she yisatem hagolel. Okay, so a person, so that person is really the proposition, the person who is arguing the affirmative of what we just heard. Anything that you say to a deceased person, they know until you roll over that tombstone on top of the aron, on top of the casket. Okay, V'chad Amar, and the other one said, Ad she yitakel habasar. Okay, so the second person says, actually, it's not that the person hears everything that is said to them, or rather, I should say, the deceased person hears everything that is said to them until the tombstone is rolled over. Actually, it's much longer. The timeline is way longer. It's until their entire flesh decomposes. Okay, very interesting. And now we see that there's a defense here. So we're going to skip over to the English for this piece, just so that we can move a little bit quicker through this text. But each person, we don't know which is which, but each person brings a verse to defend their argument. So the one who said, until the flesh decomposes, that was the second person, right? Supports it with this verse from Job, which is a really interesting verse, and we could probably spend an entire class on this verse alone. But his flesh grieves for him, and his soul mourns over him. So interesting that this idea that our bodies and our souls grieve for what was before, for the life that we had be'olam hazeh, in this world. Okay, super interesting. And the other person who was the proposition, the person who was on the affirmative, The verse that that person brings is, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and then the gloss provides us with the rest of the verse, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Right? We talked about the different pieces of the soul, and maybe we'll get to it later, but the spirit, the ruach, that's a piece of our soul, according to these sages, and even more so, it's dictated by the Kabbalists in a very, very both esoteric and detailed way, depending on how deeply you read.
By the way, this verse from Ecclesiastes, and if I'm not mistaken, chapter 12 is the last chapter in Ecclesiastes, is often regarded in the community of Bible scholars in academia as one of the signature proofs for Ecclesiastes being Greek influenced wisdom literature. So Ecclesiastes is a rather later book, as canon criticism might describe it, a book in terms of when it was composed, because it bears a few of the hallmarks of having been influenced by Greek philosophy. Which so you have, ideas that are kind of part of the larger Hellenic worldview, starting to come about in the sixth or seventh, probably sixth century BCE. This idea that we have seen is not really found in Torah, that death is the moment when body and soul separate. So that you have these kind of like two separate components that comprise a human life, the body and the soul. That is not an idea native to the earlier parts of scripture, but by the time you get to a book like Ecclesiastes in the order of composition, you see some of these ideas weave in, and unsurprisingly, the rabbis are going to lift from the books that are identified with this. The three signature books of so-called wisdom literature that bear this stamp of having been influenced by Greek thought are Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and Job. So, not surprisingly, we're seeing proof text coming from those very sources. And I just wanted to point out that you're like, oh, wait a minute, this seems like a new idea in Judaism. That's exactly right.
Beautiful, beautiful. And also it's even more interesting because if we remember one of the texts that we learned in the very beginning of this study, our sages said anyone who dabbles in not so traditional and, dare they say, heretical books is not going to the world to come. So I'm sure that they would refute this claim that these three books of wisdom literature in our canon, in our Tanakh, are even remotely influenced by those things, by Greek philosophy. Even though when we read them, we can see the obvious Greek philosophical tendencies. We're going to pause for 1 second to get some questions, and I see a few raised hands, and then we'll go back into the text. Audrey.
Thank you. I have two questions. One
Sure.
thing was, obviously, this was the first Shiva, if you go back, when the 7 days.
Mm-hmm.
The reform, I'm a little concerned because the reform, I think, allows you 3 days, 2 to 3 days, if you don't do the full seven. Are we denying a loss or a soul that left comfort by
Mm.
shortening it?
It's such a great question. Um, so if we look at, there's another part of the Talmud that talks about who are these different traditions for? Who are these specific mourning rites for? And there's an argument that the mourning rites are for the soul that has departed. The mourning rites are for the tradition that lives on. Um, the mourning rites are for the family. And it's that last one that kind of wins out in the argument. And it also I'm just thinking of this now, but it also um, is really a proponent argument um, for the way that uh, that life is for the living in our tradition, that these mourning rites at the very end of the day are not for what was once. It's actually for what will be. And so we in the Reform movement take that very seriously. And if there's a family that cannot stomach having people in their home for many days at a time in this way that Shiva often is, or a family that does not want to gather with each other. Perhaps there's some kind of acrimonious tension in the family, which is not uncommon, significantly more common than we might think. Then that family is completely allowed by Jewish law, even in the Talmud, as well as in the Shulchan Aruch that actually carries the law, to do as many days or as few days as they can handle and as they think is right for their family. There's often a conversation that happens between a bereaved family and their clergy person in which they say, I want to do it all right. I want to do this all right. But really, what is correct, what is right in Jewish law, is ensuring that there is a meaningful experience for the family. And if having Shiva for 7 days is actually going to diminish the memory of our loved one, that's the last thing that we want to do.
That's I couldn't have said it better myself. We're always asked that question, by the way. I mean, this is where whatever is written down in our codes of law uh, and standard practice as understood in the Orthodox community, Reform Jews have an orientation toward Judaism and halakha, Jewish law, specifically, that is described best by the following three words: informed autonomous choice. So, in Reform Judaism privileges the right and ability of every person who's participating in the Jewish tradition at the end of the day to make their own thoughtful choice. But many people bypass the word informed. They focus on autonomous choice and they forget that there's a very high burden of educating oneself so that one can make a thoughtful Jewish principled decision from a standpoint of knowledge. For me, any question, well, Rabbi, do I have to sit Shiva for 7 days? That's an invitation to learning. Learn the tradition. And then the only other thing I would add is, and this is one of the eye-opening features of this morning's study thus far, is to note that even though we do wind up, I think, saying that, look, the tradition emphasizes that these rituals of mourning are for the living, not the dead. Quite obviously, there's enough in the tradition that warrants discussion around, well, wait a minute, there is some benefit that our tradition assigns to these mourning rituals that is conferred upon the dead themselves, right? They can't rest until we do the thing that honors their life. It's a little bit of both, though, again, in lived Jewish practice, particularly in our Reform community, particularly our orientation to death in the modern world in 2025 here in the States, I do tend to emphasize, look, these rituals are for the living. So if it is a burden for you to keep your home open for 7 days, particularly if your, Nebuch brother-in-law is going to be sleeping on your couch and getting in the way of grieving in a proper way, it's okay. And it's nice to know that the Talmud also authorizes permissions around not going the whole 7.
And I also wanted to get back, thank you. And I also wanted to get back to the idea of the dead can hear you until you've covered the grave with a tombstone. But
or until the flesh decomposes, depending on which Amora, first generation Amora you want to believe.
Right, but our tradition is to wait for an unveiling, and that's what, usually 11 months, I think. So
Yes,
that
so
means they can hear you for 11 months.
So actually, the piece that we're not going to get to, it comes right after what we'll be reading, or a page or so after what we'll be reading, talks about how for some people, this separation between the physical and the spiritual, the separation between the body and the soul, happens in 1 second. It happens as soon as the person passes. For some people, for other people, it is a long process of separation, and the sages even say the person who is more connected to the material world and relationships in the world of the living, it takes a lot longer for that person to separate for that person's soul to separate from their body. And in that case, it can take up to 11 months. And I'll even say that when we're doing the ritual cleansing of a deceased person, the tahara experience, one of the things that you make sure not to do is to pass anything over the deceased person. So, we're holding buckets, we're doing a hygienic cleaning, cleansing. We would never pass something over the deceased person because it's believed that that area above the deceased person is still their real estate, and you might interfere with that disconnection between the soul and the body.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Great question. Great question.
Thank
Joe. Oh, you got to unmute, Joe. You're still muted, Joe. Oh, there we go.
Could you scroll back to the first two paragraphs?
Sure.
I stepped away for a moment, but I wonder if anybody commented on,
Sure. Here's paragraph number 1,
yeah, scroll down a little bit.
and then here's paragraph number 2.
I was questioning because I'm always considering while I'm thinking of what's being said and what we're reading, I'm always considering in the back of my mind, someone has written this.
Mm.
So I'm always questioning, when did they write it? What were their influences? What was life like then? What was the education of those people? And are we any wiser? Or are we just as wise today and can make our own interpretations? And I was just wondering about the dream down near the bottom of that paragraph.
Put your mind
Rev
to it.
Yehuda dreamt and said, put your mind. The man said, the deceased said to, I was thinking that to me, it would more likely be that that was written that way to overemphasize the fact that this deceased really came back and it made it a sort of a blessing. I'm thinking more what really happened is Rev Yehuda said to himself, I did a good thing, and a good thing happened, and we should continue doing that thing.
Beautiful, beautiful.
And then in the next paragraph,
Mhm.
roll up to the next paragraph. No,
Right here?
yeah, the two rabbis disagreeing.
Yeah.
I'm asking myself, they say something that can't be proven. How can they justify or rationalize one decision or one sage's comments or interpretation over the other? So then that reminds me of there are three ways to look at things: your way, my way, and the right way. So I'm left with that situation. Okay.
Very
Yeah,
Talmudic,
perhaps
Joe.
perhaps that's significant or signifies the two Jews, three opinions. If we have time and we get to it, the first class that I ever taught on death and dying was called Two Jews, Three Afterlives. So you're totally right, that a lot of the Talmud, a lot of the claims that we make especially when it comes to death and dying. Our tradition makes a lot of claims that cannot be proven. And perhaps that's part of the that's part of what we're trying to do. That's part of the learning, in order to put ourselves in another person's shoes and say, well, this person really believes this other thing. We are able to develop some empathy, and we're also able to just continue to sharpen our debate skills and our articulation of our own opinions and thoughts here. I just do want to comment on this dream sequence here.
Yeah.
There's a very famous line. If we ever get into dreams or teach a Talmud class on dreams, there's a very famous line. Dream uninterpreted is like a letter unopened. And here we have, perhaps this is Rabbi Yehuda's interpretation, or even the narrative of the narrator of the Talmud's interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda's dream. And maybe Joe, you're assisting us in interpreting Rabbi Yehuda's dream a step further of, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. If you do a mitzvah, it causes another mitzvah to happen. And so we see that Rabbi Yehuda is really trying to say, I did this great thing. I want to feel good about it, and I want it to continue to happen. I want my community to say, okay, well, maybe we should think about if there aren't challenges in the family, or if shiva is not too much of a hardship for 7 days, maybe we should think about doing that. Beautiful. Arlene, please.
Yes, I'm wondering whether we're going to see anything in any of the readings about the unveiling of a tombstone and when that was introduced.
Yes, absolutely. We're not going to do it today, but it's a great topic, and we'll be sure to include it in the future.
Okay.
Doug
Thank
and
you.
Marge, please. Oh, you're on mute.
Just want to say to Arlene, it looks lovely behind you, Arlene, palm trees and everything. The rest of us are insanely jealous.
So I am in Miami Beach right now, and that is why I could not attend what Jonathan was describing earlier. And yes, it's about 82 degrees.
Oh, yeah,
Oh
well,
my
good for you.
gosh.
Okay.
The jealousy increases.
Thank you.
Yes, for sure. Look, I really have to believe that the rabbis literally believed none of this. That they didn't think that people after, the last breath were actually listening to them. So clearly there's a larger lesson here. And I think the lesson to take away is just the broader one of maybe Lashon Hara, be careful of the things you say. It's all intended, I think, to increase empathy and connection. Maybe it's been interpreted modernly as, don't speak ill of the dead, in popular language, but it just seems to me that the larger lesson here is one of compassion, kindness, not talking evil. I mean, the rabbis are basically saying there's not really a good time, to talk about somebody who's dead in a negative way. It's just something, let's just avoid that kind of stuff.
Doug, it's so interesting that you say that. That was really not my read at all. And I love that this is bringing about some pligi of our own, some debate and division, though, for the sake of heaven, of our own here.
Until the trees begin to move and the waters shift, I think you and I will have the debate, Alyssa.
Duke, exactly. I when I read this, and now my eyes are being opened a little bit. I thought that this was really saying that our connection is not really ever severed, and it's not about talking ill of the dead, but rather instead always being able to get in touch with that spirit that once lived among us. And going back to this idea of nach, of both comfort and rest, it kind of says though we might not be laden with mourning and completely consumed by our grief, we're never actually fully severed from those who came before us.
Yeah, I think, I certainly agree with that point of view too. And it just leads me to one brief story about the funeral that was taking place, and an acquaintance of the dead person gets up and he's going to give a eulogy, and he says every rotten, miserable thing he can possibly think of about the deceased. And finally somebody from the back yells out, "Can't you say anything good about this guy?" And the guy says, "Yeah, his brother was worse."
I'm going to remember that for some of my more challenging funerals, and you really got a great laugh out of my dad there. That was good. That was good. One thing that we're taught as rabbis, and that is or as clergy, and that's also infused in halachic literature, that when you're doing a eulogy, you have to tell the truth. You can frame it in beautiful ways, but you can't lie about who the person was. Okay, so I want to return to our text for the few minutes that I have left before I turn it over to my esteemed colleague and mentor. So it's so funny that we have this argument and they come with these proof texts, and then what happens is that the argument stops. The narrator of the Talmud says, "Oh, you used this verse from Ecclesiastes, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, the sages taught. Haruach tashuv el ha-Elohim asher netana. The same exact verse is brought up. Tana lo kamo she nitana lecha betohora. Okay, so it says, and in other words, God gave it to him, i.e. the soul or the life force, if you will, just like he gave it to you, to all of you people. And God gave it to you in this specific way of being tahor, of being pure, batahara, af atabatara. And so too, you should give it back when you die in a state of purity. Okay, so our Talmud says, you know what? What the heck does that really mean? What does that mean? And in order to understand what it means, we need to bring a mashal or a mashal in a slightly different pronunciation. And I'm sure that this group has come across this word. This word literally means parable. It's also, and here's a parable. And that's really the function. It comes with some kind of analogy or analogous story to what we're learning, trying to illustrate what's going on. We're just going to read this in English so that we can get through it a little bit quicker. The Gemara cites a parable. Here we go. Mashal. Of a king of flesh and blood who distributed royal garments to his servants. Okay, we all know, if we've ever seen a mashal before, that the king of flesh and blood is analogous to God. God is always the king or the person who is called royalty in this moment. The wise ones of the servants folded them and placed them in a box, a kufsa, to protect them, whereas the foolish ones on the other side went and worked in them. After a period of time, the king requested that his garments be returned to him. The wise ones returned them to him pressed, as they were when the servants received them. And the foolish ones, those who were tipesh, that's the word that's used, the foolish ones returned them dirty. The king was happy to greet the wise ones and angry to greet the foolish ones. Okay, so my question to you is, what do you think these garments represent? What do you think these garments represent?
Good and bad.
Yeah, okay, good and bad. There's definitely a dichotomy between the foolish and the wise ones. Excellent. Anyone else? Let me ask you something further. Do these garments represent the physical bodies that we are given, that we live our lives in, that enable us to be a part of the world of the living, Olam Hazeh, this world, are the garments representative of something else? What do we
How
think?
successful we've been.
How successful we've been. Define success, Judy.
I guess it's what kind of human being you are. How you
Okay.
how you help mankind, and not success materialistically.
Yeah.
What
Okay.
kind of human?
Beautiful. Beautiful. What kind of person have you been? Are you a person who was able to keep your garments clean? Were you a person who was able to act purely, perhaps, or in a way of ritual purity, or were your garments sullied by your sins? Alan, go ahead.
I hit it by mistake.
Oh, okay. Peter.
I'm puzzled by the fact that the clothes are put away. Well, they're put away and forgotten and not used, but made use of. Whereas the ones who were working them made good use of them. And if they get dirty, that's because they've been used. Or does it mean they got dirty because they were careless?
That's a great question. I love that. Wonderful. Anyone else? Yeah, Dad.
I'm actually a little confused by the reading there, Rabbi. It seems to me that life is a messy thing. It's a dirty thing, and better to have worn the clothes and done your life as completely as you can, rather than to just compartmentalize it and put it in the closet and never take the clothes out to wear.
Yeah, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and that's what I thought as well when I first read this. And we'll get to the kind of conclusion that I and some other halachic documents came to in just a second. Go ahead, Linda. Oh, you've got to unmute, Linda.
Yeah. I also find it very confusing. I mean, these are gifts from God. Is it saying that you're not supposed to use your gifts from God and just return them like they were? That makes no sense. It makes no sense to me.
Beautiful. So there were a few different things that I found in my halachic research here. The first was saying that this is not trying to say that you shouldn't move through life and you shouldn't make mistakes and grow from them, but instead you should seek to live as ritually pure and as mitzvah oriented, similar to what Judy, you said, a life as you possibly can. So, and if you were able to do that, you would surely have ritually pure or clean robes, clean clothing, clean garments at the end. Another understanding, which is one that really resonates with me a little bit more is that when you go through life, when you come into life, you're whole, you're complete, and wholly complete. And as you move through life, you do get sullied just a little bit, or maybe even a lot of it. And this was actually a motivation to have some kind of what has grown into the main work of a Chevra Kadisha in Tahara, but some kind of ritual at the end of life that enables a person to become ritually pure again, to take whatever sullied garments you might have worn and to launder them yourself, as it were. And we see this, more mystical texts, when they're talking about this, use these few verses from Isaiah in which there is a ethereal vision of Isaiah being thrown into the dirt and his clothes becoming completely drenched in mud, and then almost pulled up to the heavens where his clothes are taken from him and he is dressed in priestly garments. And this is to say that our world, it's hard to live a life that is completely mitzvah oriented, and no one is really able to do that in a whole way. And yet there are different rituals that allow us to move into a place of at least ritual purity, if not full purity, if not whole purity. Judy, please.
Yes, I'm wondering if vidui, before you die, would be part of that, confessing to things that you know you had done wrong, but you get rid of them and you are prepared to put on the white robe.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. There is one more little piece I want to do, and I'll just read through it here because it goes back to our verse with the Tzroach Chaim in it. We have, oh no, I am not sharing. Sorry about that. And then we'll do the handoff. We have in a Braita, we get our verse again, and the souls of your enemies God shall sling out of the palm of the slingshot, right? That was the second half of our verse. And we'll see both the first and the second really at play in this Braita, a piece of text that was written around the same time as the Mishnah, but didn't quite make it in. It was taught in a Braita that Rabbi Elazar says, the souls of the righteous are stored beneath the throne of glory. So that's where all of our souls are bound up. That's where our Tzroach Chaim is. And as it is stated, and the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life, right? That's our verse. And the souls of the wicked are continuously tied up, and one angel stands at one end of the world, and another angel stands at the other end of the world, and they sling the souls of the wicked back and forth. This is just a terrific image. We can talk more about what it might mean to one another as it is stated. And then we have the second half of our verse. And the souls of your enemies God shall sling out of the palm of the sling. It's really an incredible piece. Maybe we'll come back to the very end of this piece another time. But it is just such an evocative image of the souls of those who are wicked being thrown back and forth from one end to the other. Truly an understanding of not nach, of not resting, of not being comfortable. And with that, I hand it over to Rabbi Blake. Oh.
Let's get Russell's comment. I'll take it and you'll answer it. Okay.
Well, thank you. I just want to say that from the literary point of view, I'm in awe of these runaway metaphors that are going on here. And it makes me realize, maybe because of the very, very profound and paradoxically elevated subject matter here, that metaphor plus faith equals mysticism. And I wonder if these references to all of these metaphors, culminating in that story about parallels, is a reminder that our metaphors are going to live beyond us. Live your life not in a literal world, but live your life as the parable and as the metaphors that are going to carry on after you.
Beautiful. And I'm sure you, Rabbi Blake, can do this better than I can because your mind is really equipped to do this. But I'm sure that you can think of all of these different metaphors that we use today that are thousands and thousands of years old. And one of them, not a metaphor, but one of them within our Talmud is actually avracadabra, which is the origin of abracadabra. That's the one that comes to my mind most immediately. But I bet you have more, John.
Possibly.
Just in the movie Nuremberg trials, did you guys? That was just in the movie at the very end. Did anybody see that movie?
What, the abracadabra?
Yeah, and he did it in the new movie that just came out. That was the last scene.
So cool. Yeah, literally from Aramaic, I will speak and thereby create.
Yeah.
So I cast an incantation and the reality comes to pass. So but hold in mind this metaphor, this image of the garments, because they're going to find a way back by the end of our study today. So our complementary text is taken from Gemara, from the Bavli, Shabbat, Ketubot, page 111b. You don't have to find it. I found it for us. So here's our text. Amar, and look at the left-hand column. We're going to refer to the right-hand biblical proof text in a moment. Amar Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar said, Amei ha'aratzot einan chayim shenemar. Oh, this is quite a claim. The Amei ha'aratzot, literally the peoples of the land, but Am ha'aretz in the singular, Amei ha'aratzot in the plural construct form, is a well-attested, long-standing Hebrew idiom meaning the common folk, the hoi polloi, the uneducated, the ordinary people, in contradistinction to the object of discourse in much of Talmudic literature, which are the educated, the rabbis, right? Rabbis writing about rabbis for rabbis is often a framework that we kind of assume when we approach this literature. So now they're going to talk about folks who aren't rabbis, folks who wouldn't be reading this in the first place, the commoners. Amei ha'aratzot einan chayim. They are not living. They are not alive, or they will not come to life. They will not have life. And you can see what Steinsaltz has done for us. I mean, this is really an important gloss. Otherwise, it might not be obvious to the reader. All of the stuff in plain print, not boldface, is not in the text itself. That's a gloss from Steinsaltz. So he's making it clear that, no, this is a passage about resurrection of the dead and what awaits the person who has died. But he's already kind of planting a flag by asserting, well, this only applies to people who are educated. Now, what's the proof for this? How can you say such an audacious thing? Shenemar, as it is said, metim bal yichyu vagomer. All right, so the dead will not live. Where is that from? Well, it happens to be from the verse that I've called up here from the book of Isaiah. Now, this is a psalm that is attributed to King Solomon, as you can see going back to the beginning, of Psalm 26. I thought it was. Well, maybe I'm just mistaken. I thought I had noted that, and now I don't actually see my proof for it. So that is unhelpful. So let's go down a little bit. the reference point here is rulers other than you possessed us, but only your name shall we utter. So this is a song of praise. O Eternal One, may you appoint well-being for us, since you have also requited all our misdeeds, just as you have given us the appropriate punishment for everything we've done wrong by sending us into exile and what have you. O Eternal One, our God, rulers other than you possessed us, but only your name shall we utter. So we come back to you, God, as your servants. And then this is really interesting. So metim bal yichyu, that's the phrase that is being cited. They are dead. They can never live. Shades, they can never rise. Of a truth, you have dealt with them and wiped them out, have put an end to all mention of them, presumably the foreign nations that have oppressed the Jewish people. So this is, in the source material, a kind of a swipe against the Gentile nations that have enslaved, oppressed, exiled the Jewish people. This is being lifted out wholesale, just these two words, or these three words, metim bal yichyu, the dead will not live, as a proof for the concept that is stated by Rabbi Elazar, that the ordinary folk, or the uneducated folk, the common folk, will not come back to life. Tanya namehachi. So we also have a place where this is taught in a Baraita. Tanya, again, a Mishnaic term, specific term that means to teach or to recite. So namehachi means it is also taught in a Baraita, would be the way to translate that little phrase that really is a mechanic of Talmud here. This is how a hermeneutic, how this is one specific formula that the Talmud uses to back up a claim. Look into a Baraita, an earlier Mishnaic era teaching that says, metim bal yichyu, taking this phrase from Psalms that the dead will not come to life, yachol lakol. Okay, you might think that that means everyone, right? If you're dead, you ain't coming back. Dead is dead is dead. You might, yachol. It could be, yachol means can or able, but in this case, idiomatically in Talmudic parlance, yachol lakol means you might think that this applies to kol, to everyone. Talmud lomar, but rather it is taught rifaim bal yakumu. This is the very next phrase from Isaiah. Did I say Psalms? No wonder. Okay, I was sorry. My head is in a couple of different places this morning. So Isaiah continues the verse by saying, Rifaim bal yakumu, the shades will not arise. All right. Or here it says, the dead live not. One might have thought that this is referring to everyone. Therefore, the verse says, the shades will rise not. This teaches, here's the translation, that the verse is speaking of one who weakens himself from matters of Torah. So the rabbis are engaging in something that scholars like to call paranomasia, P-A-R-A-N-O-M-A-S-I-A, wordplay, punnery. So they are taking this word here, which is rifaim, which means, in this context, it means shades, dead people. All right, the dead will not arise. And the interpretation, punning, word playing with rifaim is bimarpeh. Okay, so, well, that doesn't look like rifaim to somebody who doesn't know how Hebrew works, but in Hebrew, you kind of just have to find the root letters. The resh and the pei are the same as the resh and the pei. Here, the rabbis are saying, read it the following way. Bimrape atmo midivrei Torah, one who weakens himself from words of Torah. It's a stretch, but okay. The rabbis often stretch the language. One who weakens himself from words of Torah, hakatuv medaber. That's the one the scripture is talking about. So what's the takeaway here? Well, we have this assertion that only the common folk, only those who are not enlightened by Torah will not be resurrected in the hereafter. Well, that's the assertion, but you're going to see that this plays out over the next few paragraphs in a really fun way. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Yochanan enters the discussion and he says, and all of a sudden we have flipped to Aramaic because he's writing in a context of Aramaic language being his vernacular. La nicha lamaraihu de amrat lehu hachi. All right, as translated here, their master, maraihu, maraihu is master, from the Hebrew word mar, which means one's master. Even in today's polite modern Hebrew, if you were meeting Mr. Horowitz for lunch, he would be on the reservation as Mar Horowitz. Mar, master or sir, Mr. It's the same, by the way, as Mr. Okay, lemaraihu de amrat lehu hachi. So their master, meaning that is to say God, is not pleased that you would say this about ordinary Jews. So Rabbi Yochanan takes up the discussion here and says, come on, that's not nice. You're going to take this swipe, you're going to disparage a Jew just because he doesn't have a lot of learning, a lot of Torah. Well, that's not okay to Rabbi Yochanan. So, hahu bimrape atzmo le'avodah zarahu dichtiv. He's saying, no, we're not talking about Jews who have weakened themselves from learning words of Torah, but rather we are talking about those who weaken themselves specifically so they're so far gone in their distance from Torah, in their Torah weakness, that they have become idol worshippers. So in other words, the rabbis here are trying selectively to determine who gets the privilege of getting resurrected. Again, if all of this surprises you, maybe you will fall into the camp that my dad asserts he is in of, quote, I can't really believe that the rabbis really believed all this stuff. So we've spent a lot of time maybe making an assumption that for the rabbis, this is all metaphor. Just hold on to that. I think that is a totally plausible assertion. And yet I want to hold out the possibility that for at least some of these rabbis, this really was a matter of life and death, or more accurately, a matter of life after death. So maybe they did, maybe they didn't. One is saying, look, no commoner, no one who is not immersed in Torah is going to get the privilege of resurrection. That's Rabbi Elazar's position. Rabbi Yochanan comes in and says, hang on. No. The only ones who are denied resurrection are those whose Torah is so weak that they have become idolaters. They've gone full bore into this grievous offense. They really are. They're not just not deeply Jewish, they're anti-Jewish. Like those are the ones, they don't get resurrected. That's not fair. When I use the word fair as a way of referring back to what we've been talking about for the last few weeks, which is that many of these traditions of what awaits us in the hereafter don't so much have to do with speculating about what things are going to be like once we're dead. They're much more about how do we measure our days and how do we reconcile the fact that people who ought to have all of the benefits of material wealth and spiritual prosperity and above all, happiness, joy in their lives, don't, even though they are pious and righteous and learned in Torah. So the Olam Haba and even the future resurrection that is proposed in these texts is really more about rectifying the injustices of this world, right? I toiled in the vineyard of Torah my entire life and I suffered. What's the deal, God? And the rabbis are saying, well, the deal is you get your due afterwards, after you die. Well, I don't love that because I want it now, but it is not I who wrote these texts. Okay. So calling the text back up onto the screen. All right. So Amarle, he said, and this is going back to Rabbi Elazar, the dialogue partner or the debate opponent who begins this sugya. Excuse me. Elazar responded, Mikra acher ani doresh. I can drash a different text. A very rabbinic thing to say, right? Somebody says, I've got a proof text that says it's my interpretation. Elazar jumps back in. He says, Mikra acher ani doresh. No, wait a second. I've got another text that I can drash, doresh, right? I can interpret another text. Dichtiv, for it is written, Ki tal orot talecha va'aretz rifaim tapil. Beautiful, beautiful verse, also from the same chapter of Isaiah. So they're actually dialoguing about this one chapter from the prophet, which says, Your dew is as the dew of light, and the earth shall bring to life the shades. That was a beautiful, if you like poetry and metaphor, Talmud is for you. Okay, so here it goes on. You can even see the full text. Yichyu metecha. So Isaiah is speaking in the language, whether he means it literally or metaphorically is a matter of, personal, I think, subjective interpretation. Let your dead revive, let the corpses arise. Awake and shout for joy, you who dwell in the dust. And here's the verse, for your dew is like the dew, for your dew is like the dew on fresh growth. You make the land of the shades come to life. So God as resurrector of the dead, it couldn't be more overt from the text here. So Elazar is back to his point, and he explains as follows, Kol hamishtamesh be'or Torah. When the prophet is talking in the language of light, what light do we know from Jewish tradition? This, of course, is the light of Torah, enlightenment, not just sunlight, not photons, right? He's talking about, no, enlightenment, the light of Torah. And we often use Torah is a flame, Torah is a candle. Even the Aramaic word for Torah, deoraita, includes the root word for light. So Torah and light are associated deeply way back in Jewish tradition. So anyone who engages in the light that is Torah, or Torah mechayehu, that light of Torah will enliven him, will invigorate him, or literally will revive him and resurrect him. Okay? V'chol she'ein mishtamesh be'or Torah, but anyone who does not engage in the light of Torah, ein or Torah mechayehu, that person has no light of Torah to revive him. All right? So Elazar is digging in on his point. He's saying, no. You got to be a Torah scholar if you want to be resurrected when you're dead. And maybe this is just a poetic plea for people to educate themselves in Torah as a way of saying, whatever else happens in this life, there is no better guarantee of a life to come than Torah. If you want to know a little bit about why some Haredi communities are the way they are and so deeply committed to the project of study of Torah instead of making an income, why they are willing to accept kind of a welfare state in Israel or in communities like Crown Heights or Monsey. Really, they're not equipped to thrive in the modern world, so they create their own enclaves where the community welfare takes care of the indigent, which are most people. This is partly why, because to engage in Torah is viewed as the signature project of a life well lived and a guarantee of a life in the hereafter, even bodily resurrection. Let's see where this goes. Kevan de chazie de kamitz ta'ar. Oh, okay, now we're back into Aramaic. And this is really a tricky text because it keeps flipping from one language to the next. So since Rabbi saw that Rabbi Yochanan was grieved over the distress of common uneducated people, in other words, Yochanan, his sparring partner in this debate, is not happy with this notion that Elazar raises that only the Torah scholars get resurrected. Yochanan is like, wait a minute. Most of the Jewish people don't rise to that level. So one has a very high bar for entry into this glorious bodily hereafter. Yochanan wants to lower the bar for entry, right? Very, very Jewish debate here. Amarle, and therefore he said to him, Rabbi, my rabbi, and I love this because these are two people who've been in a very serious dispute for the last two paragraphs, but they still call each other rabbi. Matzati lahen takana min haTorah. I think I have found a solution from the Torah. I think I have found matzati. I found for our dispute something in the Torah that's going to harmonize our difference of opinion. All right. What's his great chiddush or chap? What's his great insight into Torah? Chap is a Yiddish word that means you've hit on a way of interpreting a text that resolves a problem. So what's his chap? Well, ve'atem hadvekim badonai Elohechem chayim kulchem hayom. Anyone who cleaves to Adonai, your God, will live, all of you, this day. All right, so this is like the point. Like at the end of the day, it's not how learned in Torah you are, it's how much you are attached to God. Now, you could end the passage there, but that wouldn't be very Talmudic, would it? Because now the stam, which is the neutral third-person voice of the Torah, the narrator, right? What did you say, Rabbi?
I said neutral.
Neutral, yeah. Not so neutral. The kind of like just the narrator of the Talmud interjects and says, wait a second. How can one, is it possible for one to cleave to a Shekhinah, to a divine presence? Cleaving, the word here, by the way, dvekim, is from the root devek, which is the modern Hebrew word for tape or glue. It means adhesive. Something is, if you, in Hasidic thought, this is actually a spiritual, very high goal. The Hasidim talk a lot about the goal of a religious life being dvekus or dvekut, which means to cling to God, to be attached to God, to be like glued to God. And you may know another word from Yiddish, which is derived from the same root, which is a dibuk. A dibuk is like an invasive spirit of a dead person that comes to cling to or glue itself to the body of the living, right? You've been like possessed, we would say. The best word for dibuk is the one who possesses, like a demon. Demonic possession that's the Yiddish equivalent of that is the dibuk. You may have read legends about the dibuk. There is a very famous portrayal in modern cinema of the dibuk in the first 15 minutes of the Coen brothers movie, A Serious Man. Go watch it. It's the best ever. So you cleave to God. Well, he said, well, how can you cleave to something that is just a spiritual presence? Right? They're getting very literal with the language here. The hachtiv rather, the text says, Ki Adonai Elohecha eish ochla. Because the text says God is a consuming fire. In other words, God is like pure energy. How do I glue myself to that? Right? Ela, rather, kol hamasi bito letalmid hacham, anyone who marries his daughter off to a Talmud scholar. This is the workaround, the brilliant workaround. Va'oseh prakmatia, all right, and conducts business. Prakmatia, which is clearly a loan word from Greek. Anyone who does business letalmidei achamim, with scholars of Torah. V'hamechaneh talmidei achamim min chasav, and anyone who utilizes his material wealth to benefit Talmud scholars. So if you make a tzedakah, you make some tzedakah to support Talmud scholars, right? Ma'aleh alav hakatuv, the scripture will elevate him ke'ilu midabek bashchina, as if he were cleaving to the very divine presence. So the great workaround is if you support the project of scholarship by marrying your daughter off to a Talmud scholar, or by giving money to a community of Talmud scholars, that's enough. That's how you create this dvekut. That, going back to the original text, since in Talmud it's very hard to remember, what are we talking about? That too can merit one to have life in the world to come, deep, like physical resurrection. Again, the problem that they've identified is, are we really going to say that only learned people, only learned Torah scholars get to be resurrected? By the way, I would include everyone in this fine assembly in that measure. Right? We all study Talmud every week, so we get a free pass. We We don't get, we just go straight and collect our $200 and go, go to the hereafter, get resurrected. But what about the folks who only come on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Like, are they going to be denied this privilege? I'm going to take just a few more and then I'll still leave room for questions because there's a really fun thing coming up. And then it goes on to say, so it kind of affirms this idea that if you marry off your family, conduct business with Torah scholars, or use your money to benefit them, it's the same thing as, as actually, it's like studying Torah by proxy, right? And therefore you get a free pass in the world to come for resurrection. Now, my favorite two lines in this whole long sugya. I'm going to do it in English just to save us a little time. Rabbi Hiyya bar Yosef said, in the future, meaning not, next Wednesday, but at the time of the resurrection of the dead, the righteous will burst forth and arise in Jerusalem. How do we know this? We have a proof text from Psalms. And they may blossom, or may they blossom out of the city like the grass of the earth. This, by the way, was the Psalms passage I was thinking of. So I knew that I had studied of Solomon. Thank you. There it is at the beginning of the Psalm. I don't know if you can see it. Psalm 72, attributed to King Solomon the Wise. So the righteous will burst forth and arise in Jerusalem based on this verse from Psalms. And may they blossom out of the city like the grass of the earth. And the term city, what city? It's not New York. It's not Sheboygan. Of course, it is nothing other than Yerushalayim. How do we know? 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 34, for I will defend this city, in which text the city, of course, is Jerusalem. It says city in that verse. It says city in the verse from Psalms. Sorry about the formatting here. Therefore, one city equals another city, and that's the reference point. This is also a Talmudic hermeneutic, a rabbinic hermeneutic known as Gezerah Shavah, literally equal decree. If a word is used in context A and a word is used in context B, by the transitive property of rabbinic logic, it's the same thing. A equals B. Okay, now the crazy part that we finally get back to the garments. And Rabbi Hiyya bar Yosef further said, this is the same rabbi commenting, in the future, the righteous will stand up from their graves in their clothes. I know that you were thinking, you're wondering to yourself, we're learning a lot about resurrection of the dead, but what are we wearing? Are we just a bunch of if we're going to get resurrected, do I at least get to keep my nice clothes, or am I just walking around naked? That's a problem. Well, the rabbis want you to be very reassured. Don't worry, because if you merit to be resurrected, you get to do it with your clothes on. That's a very important point for the rabbis. So how do we know this? How do we know that you get resurrected with your nice duds? Well, of course, it is derived from another rabbinic hermeneutic, this one called a fortiori, which is called kal vachomer, the light and the heavy, which means if you can make a claim from a certain circumstance, how much the more so does it apply when the circumstance is somehow amplified? Let me explain. Just as wheat is going to be the example, just as wheat which is buried naked, in other words, you plant just a little seed, and yet it emerges from the ground with several layers of garb, including straw and chaff. In the case of the righteous who are buried fully clothed, all the more so do they come out of the ground properly dressed. So never fear. Wear your nice duds. I don't know how this squares with what Rabbi Plakow is deeply familiar with from her work in Chevra Kadisha, in sacred burial organization in the Jewish community of New York. But we do bury in shrouds. But this seems to imply that you should probably wear your finest because you're going to come back to life wearing what you were buried in. Wow. So do we mean literal garments? Do the rabbis actually believe all this stuff? It's hard. It's hard for me anyway to go quite so far as my dad does and say, I can't believe that the rabbis really believed this stuff, but rather they interpret it as metaphor. It seems to me that that passage in particular defies a metaphorical reading. I mean, they really seem to be talking about actual people coming back to actual life wearing actual clothing. At least
wasn't this the question that Cleopatra asked last week?
Yes, yes. So
But I said this is a goyish kind of question to ask.
Yeah, so in a few weeks ago, we learned that Cleopatra asked this to Rabbi Meir, and they had this exact same conversation, even with the wheat analogy there. And you did say, look at how we're making fools of other leaders here in the Talmud. And that's what the rabbis are trying to do. And here we have, actually, it's a conversation between two of our Rabbanim, two of our sages. But I also wanted to comment on this idea that we come fully dressed and maybe we should be buried fully dressed. There is a really shocking claim in the Zohar that says that when we are resurrected, we will be resurrected as youth, so that every person who is resurrected will be fully clothed, but not in what they're wearing when they're buried, but allegedly, if we marry these two texts, fully clothed in, I don't know. I mean, I remember when I used to wear these pink corduroy overalls, like fully clothed in those outfits of our youth. My dad is nodding. Yeah, exactly.
He remembers those pink cords.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, let me take a few other comments and then we'll wrap up 5 minutes later than we should have, but that's okay. Why don't we hear from Audrey, Eve, and then my folks will get the last word.
Okay. My question was when you talked about the only way to have a good life and to be resurrected is, and that's why the Haredi read Torah and study all the time. All right. Well,
it's one reason why.
Well,
I mean, there are also arguments within the Haredi community that, particularly in Israel, they don't need to serve in the army because studying Torah all day long confers spiritual protection on the Jewish people, precisely in battle. So they're part of the IDF in that way, but not the actual IDF, the Israel Defense Forces of studying Torah.
Right. Well, my question is, who do they think is, you said that they would take from the community to support their study and to support them. Does that mean that those who support them are not going to go and be resurrected because they're not studying, they're out working to support the studiers?
No, at least that's not the claim made here. I mean, I can't speak for modern Haredi thought. I'm very much not in that community. So I'm just an outside observer, and I would not go so far as to say I really understand how they think. I can only observe how they behave. But the text here makes it clear that the workaround is that you don't have to directly study Torah all day long yourself, so long as you are supporting the community that does, right? So that's the point. Marry your kids into that community, do business with them. More importantly, just give some of your wealth to support their project, and then we all merit a reward in the here to come.
My father would call them schnorrers.
Yeah, well, you would be in the company of most secular or even non-Orthodox Israelis who are deeply vexed by the division in society and the protections and welfare that is bestowed upon the Haredi community, because they are seen as not contributing to the economy and not contributing to defense, and yet huge amounts of resources in terms of material wealth and the protection of the IDF is given to the Haredi, including deep in settlements in the middle of the West Bank. I mean, a lot of resources of the state of Israel go to support the Haredi. So that's obviously a deeply vexing social conundrum that probably will come back onto the headlines, already is, by the way, if the ceasefire holds. There was some activity last night with air raids in Gaza. But this is still a domestic issue that has in no way been resolved, and it's tearing at the fabric of Israeli society today. Even Jay. And if you want to know more about it, come tonight to hear Anna Kislansky, and we'll talk about that, because it's very high on the agenda of the reform movement, is how we gain legitimacy in a state that does not give government subsidies to reform congregations or reform rabbis. does not help reform communities, build synagogues, sustain a staff, support their communities, because that's all given to the Rabbanut, the Orthodox rabbinate. Okay, complex. Even Jay, please.
Yeah, I mean, marrying off your daughter to a Torah scholar, okay, fine. But I have to say that the rabbis, were in those days at the academies, who weren't working and studying, were very clever putting this in the Talmud, that if you were a rich person and you helped to support them, then you got to pass.
Yeah, I agree. And this also comes from the world in which rabbis were not, that was not their source of income. Like a rabbi was not a profession or even a vocation. It was a calling or a way of life. It still is, but starting in the 19th century, influenced very much by our interactions in the Protestant world post-emancipation in Europe, and of course here in the United States, the rabbinate becomes professionalized. It becomes a job that you can do and make a living. Most rabbis throughout Jewish history had other jobs to put food on the table, but have always been dependent in some way, shape, or form, either largely or less so, on the welfare of the community to support their work. Okay, Mom and Dad, you're our last hand.
I want to apologize on your behalf for having an iconoclast and a rebel and a heretic as a father. But this whole process, this shiur that we've developed here, this chavurah, would be worth nothing if we didn't try to evolve our understanding and opinions of things. So, John, I'm working sort of towards a Dayenu moment where I'm thinking, if the historical impact of Judaism after all these years had just abandoned the idea of this afterlife, and we had Torah, we had our moral direction, we had our divine influence, Dayenu. Did we need? I mean, Christianity, Catholicism would be nothing without the resurrection of the soul, without literal heaven and hell. But I have to kind of believe that Judaism would be essentially Judaism without, we'd have to jettison parts of Maimonides for sure. But, that's what I'm thinking about now. Since it's so problematic if we had just abandoned it.
I will say, not only do I hold you both, of course, in the highest esteem, I hold your argument in high esteem, because it is an argument that is shared by some of my favorite rabbis in Jewish history, particularly the early reformers. I mean, the Reform movement was as an intellectual, the Reform movement as a movement was comprehensively social, religious, and intellectual. But I really believe that the roots of Reform were in the German universities. And that Jews were now finally, after centuries of non-acceptance in Western society, were at the turn of the 19th century finally gaining acceptance in society in such a way that they could participate in academic discourse. And you have people coming out of that system like Abraham Geiger and Samuel Holdheim and some of my favorite OG Reform rabbis who assert very much the same. They basically say, we must practice a religion that never forces us to say something that cannot rationally be believed, right? And so the origins of Reform as a movement, at least from the standpoint of who are we intellectually, how do we regard our faith or our religious tradition? They wanted to say we should not be telling our children to believe in fantasies and fairy tales. And one of the first concepts that was in their crosshairs was resurrection of the dead. So by the time you get to the Pittsburgh platform, 50, 60 years later, 1885, in America, Pittsburgh, a convening of rabbis who by that point, it was long established, they were just putting it in writing, that the resurrection of the dead, they name it directly, and other like doctrines, including, by the way, the restoration of the temple in Zion, were all unworthy of a modern, rational religion that focused on what we would call ethical monotheism. That is the Pittsburgh platform in sum. And so I think that you are in very, very good company, and you don't need to feel quite so heretical. Okay,
I am in wonderful company amongst this group that convenes every week. So
what a beautiful acknowledgement. As we have much for which to give thanks, I give thanks for everyone here, for my colleague Rabbi Platkow, for all of us learners. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. We are accordingly off next week. We are back the Thursday following, which is December 4th. We look forward to seeing you at the same bat time and bat channel, 10:15 on Thursday, December 4th. In the meantime, I hope I will see you tonight and over the weekend for Shabbat. Okay, and Judy, we'll get to your question next time. Bye, folks.
Doug, I'm on your team.
Darabah.
Bye. Hope to see you tonight. Thanks.
Anne Klein, good to see you. How you doing?
Bye.